Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm Nietzahone and I bring you a new MTG Top 10 each and every week. This week we're looking at split cards. Split cards first debuted way back in Invasion, and they have returned intermittently in Time Spiral block, in Ravnica, and in Return to Ravnica block. And a new version of the split card, those with Aftermath, were printed in Amonkhet and are legal in Standard right now. And that's what made me want to go back into the archives of Magic tournament results to see which split cards have seen the most play. Split cards are interesting because they provide a great deal of flexibility, with one card being capable of sometimes two completely different effects. Flexibility is more powerful than you think, and split cards on the whole have done quite well, with about 1/3 of all the split cards that have ever been printed receiving at least 1 point. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at how I score these lists. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they have received, with a Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. The cards in this list are arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. I also consider Legacy and Vintage Championship events as Pro Tour Top 8s, as those formats need to be properly represented in the scores of these cards. Now let's get started. At number 10, we have Assault and Battery, one of the original split cards. Both halves of this card do something for a reasonable cost. Paying 1 to do 2 damage to a creature or player at sorcery speed isn't quite shock, but it's not that far off. And paying 4 for a 3/3 elephant token isn't awesome, but it isn't much more than you'd be willing to pay. This is what makes split cards good though. It can be either of those, whichever one you need more at that point in the game. In the early game, you might want Assault, but in the later game, you might need a beefy blocker, so the 3/3 is more appealing. Assault and Battery is actually legal in Modern because it was reprinted as a time-shifted card. Its first time through Standard, it picked up 1 Pro Tour Top 8 in a red-green aggro deck that ran Fires of Yavimaya, which gave all your creatures haste. It didn't see play its second time through Standard, but it did see play in Time Spiral block, top 8ing at Pro Tour Yokohama in 2007 in a Gruul aggro deck. Again, while it's legal in Modern, the things that it does are probably just a little too underwhelming for it to see play there. And this could be one of the cards first off this list, as the new cards with the Aftermath mechanics see more play. At number 9, we have Rough and Tumble from the second block that had split cards, Time Spiral block. In this block, the split cards were actually the same color, while the Invasion split cards, which we were just looking at, were 2 different colors. Again, this card gives you some flexibility. For 2 mana, you can kill a bunch of small ground creatures, and for 6 mana, you can take down some dragons. It didn't see play in Block or Standard, or any other rotating or non-eternal format. Where it has started to see play is in one of Magic's most powerful format, Legacy, where it is frequently played in sideboards of Canadian Threshold decks. These decks run Delver of Secrets, Tarmogoyf, and Nimble Mongoose as their primary win conditions, so the rough half doesn't do much to their board. Meanwhile, it absolutely destroys decks like Merfolk and Death and Taxes, and it also helps kill Monastery Mentor. It hasn't picked up a Grand Prix Top 8 since June of 2016, but it seems likely that it gets a few more points out of sideboards. At number 8, we have Rise and Fall. In Ravnica block, the split cards were multicolored, with each half representing one of the guilds. Here we have Dimir and Rakdos represented. This made it a little more difficult to be able to cast either half, but the cards usually represented a 3-color shard, like this one does with Grixis. The Rise half of this card is where the power is, though. Bouncing a creature to your opponent's hand and getting a creature card from your graveyard is a pretty big game for only 2 mana. The Fall half is kind of underwhelming, but again, it adds some more utility to the card in the event you know your opponent has 2 non-lands in their hand that you want to get rid of, and maybe you want to cast Fall instead, making it more reasonable. In Block, it picked up a top 8 in Rakdos aggro, and in Modern, it has picked up top 8s in Grixis control and in Jund decks. This card has seen sporadic play, with its top 8 events being years apart, so it isn't easy to rule this one out completely. Maybe it will pick up another top 8 in years to come. At number 7, we have Spite and Malice, another one of the original split cards from Invasion. Each side of this card has things that control decks want to do. Spite counters spells and Malice kills creatures. It does both of these rather inefficiently, and if each of these were individual cards, they probably never would have seen play. However, the flexibility this card gave control decks is amazing, and it saw play as a result. In Block, it picked up 2 Pro Tour Top 8s in control decks, and in Standard, it picked up 1 Top 8 at Worlds in 2001 in a control deck. It never saw play outside of that year in 2001, but it had a pretty decent run while it was around in Block and Standard. At number 7, we have Crime and Punishment, another card from Ravnica block that represents 2 guilds, this one representing the Orzhov and the Golgari, which together is called Abzan these days. This card has some serious power. On one side, it is basically just a Zombify, except it can steal enchantments from graveyards too, and on the other side, it can selectively nuke the board. The Punishment half is probably the more powerful one here, but having the option to use Crime doesn't hurt. In Block, it picked up 2 Pro Tour Top 8s and 2 mid-range decks capable of casting both sides. In Extended, it picked up 3 Grand Prix Top 8s and Life from the Loam decks, basically serving as an important sweeper to buy you more time. In Modern, it has managed one Grand Prix top 8 in a Gifts Ungiven control deck, where again it was usually being cast as punishment as a way to selectively kill parts of the board. It hasn't seen play since 2012 though, and I'm not sure it has what it takes to continue to get more points. At number 5, we have another mono-red split card, and that is Dead and Gone. The Dead half is the kind of card that always sees play in Constructed because it's 1 mana to do 2 damage to a creature at instant speed. Those are things that just basically always see play in Standard, and this has some added utility thanks to Gone, and it's actually kind of weird because red doesn't really bounce creatures very often, so Gone's kind of a weird thing to have going on here. But both halves of this are instants too, which is nice because it was such efficient removal with the upside of Gone. It saw a ton of play in Time Spiral Block, picking up 3 Pro Tour top 8s at Pro Tour Yokohama in 2007, and several Grand Prix top 8s in the format as well. It has also picked up 1 Grand Prix top 8 in Modern, appearing in a Jund deck at Grand Prix Lincoln in 2012. However, it hasn't seen play outside of its block format other than that, and it seems unlikely to accumulate very many more points. At number 4, we have Far and Away. So when we returned to Ravnica, we got split cards again. This time with a little something extra that added even more flexibility to the cards. We got the Fuse mechanic, which meant you could do the usual things with a split card, cast only 1 half, but you also had the option to cast both halves if you paid the mana cost of both of them. So with Far and Away, you could pay a total of 5 mana to bounce a creature and force your opponent to sacrifice another one, which is pretty brutal, especially at instant speed. As a result, this thing saw a significant amount of play in control decks. At the Block Pro Tour Dragon's Maze in 2013, Far and Away picked up 3 top 8s in Esper control decks, a deck that was pretty much ported to Standard too, where it continued to pick up top 8s. It never saw play outside of Block or Standard, but it is a good representative of the cool design space and flexibility that split cards provide, something I think the newer Aftermath cards do well too. At number 3, we go back to the original cycle of split cards again in Invasion, where Wax and Wane was printed. This card could either be a decent combat trick or a really efficient way to blow up enchantments. Both halves had their place, and the flexibility of the card made it a reasonable card to mainboard, especially in a format that had Fires of Yavimaya. That enchantment we mentioned when talking about Assault and Battery that gave creatures haste, and that Standard format also had Parallax Wave, a powerful enchantment with an Oblivion Ring-like effect. In Standard, Wax and Wane picked up 3 top 8s at Pro Tour Chicago in 2000 because the metagame was filled with decks running those 2 cards. A Rebels deck, a Fires of Yavimaya deck, and a green-red-white control deck all packed the card into their main board. In Extended, it saw the most play though, appearing in various decks that were capable of casting both halves, including 3-Deuce, Threshold, Junk, and Super Grow. At number 2, we have the card that I thought would be number 1 on this list, Fire and Ice. This thing has seen a ton of play, and is another good example of how good having 2 choices on 1 card is. Either half of this card is, individually, nothing special and constructed. There are more efficient ways to do what these cards do, but the fact that this gives you a choice of 2 different effects, both of which are pretty nice, especially in control decks, made it a heavily played card in multiple formats. In Standard, it saw play primarily in Psychotog control decks, but also in Squirrel Opposition and Blue-Green Madness. It amassed some pretty great numbers there, the most impressive of which being taking 4 of the top 8 slots at Worlds in 2002, and 5 of the top 8 slots at Grand Prix Taipei in the same year. It saw play in Extended too, primarily in control decks. One of the nastiest things to do with this card was to put it on Isochron Scepter, meaning you got to make the choice between the 2 cards over and over again every time you use the Isochron Scepter's activated ability, which is a pretty painful thing to have to deal with if you're the one staring that down. It also saw play in Extended Psychotog, Blue-Red Control, Enduring Ideal decks, and so on in Extended. Fire and Ice has proven to be so powerful that it has also seen a ton of play in Legacy, and even in Vintage in various control and mid-range decks, including Canadian Threshold, Blue-Red Delver, Landstill, and Monastery Mentor decks. Fire and Ice is still seeing play in Eternal formats, and along with the number 1 card in this list, is the only card still actively putting up a ton of points. And at number 1, we have another card with Fuse, which is what makes this one so powerful, and that is Wear and Tear. Because you can cast both halves for only 3 mana, it can enable 2-for-1s, and because artifacts and enchantments are things that most sideboards want to have something to blow up, lots of decks just run this since it is so flexible and can deal with both types of permanents, while still only taking up 1 slot in your sideboard. It first saw some play in Block, putting up 5 Grand Prix top 8s and 1 Pro Tour top 8, all in Boros aggro decks. Wear and Tear benefited from being in a Standard when Theros Block was, which meant that there were even more enchantments than usual running around for it to blow up, and really, the Tear half was the most efficient way to do this in the format. It also sees a ton of play in Modern, where it has put up most of its numbers. Modern is a format where artifacts are all over the place, particularly in affinity decks, and enchantments like Phyrexian Unlife aren't unheard of either. As a result, most decks that can cast both halves pack a few of these into their sideboard in Modern. It was played even more when Splinter Twin was legal in the format, but right now it still sees play in Death Shadow Zoo, Affinity decks, and Naya Burn. It has also seen play in Legacy, a format with powerful equipment that can quickly be cheated into play with Stoneforge Mystic, alongside some commonly played enchantments. In Legacy, it has mostly seen play in Miracles, and while that deck has now been banned out of the format, it will still find itself in a few sideboards in that format. It isn't unheard of to see in Vintage either, a format with powerful artifacts and an entire deck built around the enchantment Oath of Druids. It has actually picked up 2 Vintage Championship top 8s in control decks like Blue-Red Delver. Wear and Tear seems like a likely candidate to hold on to this top spot, even in the face of the new Aftermath cards, but time will tell. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button. If you want to suggest future ideas for a top 10 or have any questions about this top 10, post them in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you catch all of my future top 10s and you're not already a subscriber, go ahead and subscribe. You can also head over to the Ether Hub where I do a top 10 list, not quite weekly, but I do very frequently top 10 lists over there as well. And finally, my content is sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all things Magic. You can head over there and buy some really sweet playmats, creature tokens, and you can use my discount code NITZAHONE5 to get a 5% discount there. Thanks for watching.